Hello, thank you for listening. This is the near death experience of Diego, and this experience was translated from Spanish. I think Diego is from Colombia. The experience date is unknown. It was documented on May 29th, 2017. Open quote. While resting on my bed, I was surprised to be looking down on myself from the upper part of the roof. I was floating above my body, and at first, I didn't recognize it. At first, I thought, who was I observing? Because of this, my body seemed very strange. Then I heard a voice saying, "Let's go." I sensed an entity close by. In spite of not going to it, we began to ascend as if through a viaduct. We were surrounded by humid clouds that seemed to be refreshing. I observed other viaducts through which other beings ascended. I perceived the sensation that this earthly life was ending, and I said to myself, "Is this what is going to happen?" And the voice answered, "It could be." I had come out of my body, securely ascending and floating towards a place where I observed a subtle blue haze and then an intense gloom. I continued rising until I was in a rectangular room. Suddenly, I was beside two beings that I could only observe with my lateral vision. They had expressive and large eyes. I asked, "Is this a definite act?" And they then replied, "Possibly." Then I asked myself, "Am I dreaming?" And the entities replied, "No, you are not dreaming. Look at your family now." And there appeared in front of me, at a certain distance, as if posing for a photo, a large amount of people from my family, some recognizable and others not, but having a great resemblance between them. They were presented to me as ancestors that I didn't recognize, and children nearby that had died young. They smiled at me. They seemed grateful and happy to see me. I also experienced a kindness and a sense of pleasure at recognizing most of them, and those of whom I had the most pleasant memories with. I tried to approach them, but they told me not to do so. I felt a sensation of warmth so great that I never wanted to return. I felt a subtle nostalgia from being unable to hug them, especially my father and my grandparents. Then they faded away little by little, and there appeared a great variety of tapered openings. Ascending through their lower and very deep angle emerged figures of people that sprang forth, and I saw their little heads all the time very low at the beginning of their ascent. Suddenly, in one of the channels, I saw what seemed like the image of my kind mother, who was also ascending. I asked if it was her allotted time, and they said to me, "Quite possibly, but not very soon." Many arrived, and we looked at each other. We recognized our familial physique, although I didn't remember them specifically or exactly. Others were totally unrecognizable. It would be more than 10 years later when I would really be able to recognize them as part of the family or as friends of my brother, Carlos Alberto. I saw other entities who I heard saying that I found myself in a stage of profound transition. They said that I could continue, but they didn't know whether if I went to the end with them that I could never return. I wanted to know that there was no risk in continuing too far, to which they responded that from here on there was an enormous risk of never being able to return. Nevertheless, I decided to carry on, and I went into a creamy area as if it was a giant canal. I climbed, and from the bottom of which emerged a brilliant and explosive light of reddish and orange tone. A monologue began in which my whole life was reviewed. I observed all my elucidated acts from the past. I asked myself if I would have achieved it if they had been any different, but I was made aware that it's not worthwhile to judge them or take them as synthesizable. It wasn't about making judgments or being defensive. In spite of all this, my curiosity made me greatly want to see the possibilities and chances of these occurrences and events. I then enjoyed balancing the feelings of playing with my guilt and retaliation that I should have assumed, but of those which I was not burdened with any dissatisfaction. I understood that the methods and resources that I had at hand to be able to spend through the artifacts of this past life were sufficient and agreed with my conscience. I felt around me a bluish stupor. Then I saw figures of kind beings that greeted me and agreed with the considerations in my thoughts. I found that events that seem important during the course of life isn't so important. I then identified myself with ego. I'm sorry. I then identified myself with my ego of Diego. I decided that within the transcendental, there were some things that I would have liked to analyze as to their function at the moment of the action. But they reiterated again, nothing was that important and that everything had been a part of my development. Nevertheless, they allowed me to understand all the contradictions, actions, and situations in which I felt wrong or obliged to accept them despite seeming irrational. Their words were precise for my well-being and inner peace. I went into an intense inner dialogue, justified the past occurrences, or determining them fortuitously. They said to me that everything that I had been feeling was part of the game that comprised part of the evolution. But in reality, none of it was important. I understood that everything was valid and excusable because my position in earthly life was no more than a game of evolutionary experiences. At that moment, I saw the lucid eyes of my companions and I began to concentrate. The perception of the events in my life was simultaneous. I wanted to ask so many questions. I understood that the bigger part of our ambitions was ambivalent. My whole life appeared like a film, but in 3D, and happened at a great speed. I managed to ask if I could see it at a slower speed to savor and better balance some of the interesting periods, but they replied that it wasn't worthwhile, that it wasn't necessary to analyze it because in the end I would know very well what it would mean. Everyone spoke with great kindness. Nevertheless, I felt very nostalgic, but one thing was clear. There were no transcendental terms of analysis. I asked myself if the people I knew were aware where they were because some went and others returned, appearing disconcerted. I continued going up. These beings that were with me were so kind and discreet, yet also unreadable and unfathomable when I asked certain questions and they replied with a simple smile. The communication was always telepathic and they instantly knew what I was thinking. Their replies were essential, concise, precise, and certain. They were beings, capital B, of great peace, without adornments, and with a tender sense of humor. Everything was understood without the need to say anything. After having stopped the outlining of my cultural origins, they guided me as they happily said to me, "None of this is important." I rested a while, becoming peaceful and at the same time ascending through a yellow, opaque, yet translucent duct. I saw beings that symbolically stripped away their physical remnants now that they were no longer needed. I passed through what looked like a train station. I saw people that were received and were guided and helped to leave their life on earth. There were some beings that I had known for about 20 years, and I had never seen them again. I asked them what they were doing there, and they explained to me what type of illness they had had. There had been two people that I didn't know that I knew years later in the physical dimension, and I asked them what they were doing there. They said they were attending a very serious health problem, and they almost had died. But finally they were better and were finally going back to their bodies. Nevertheless, there was a friend there from my family that would leave his body in a decisive way. Some beings then arrived to accompany another friend that had been too gravely ill to return to his body. Another group ascended, and between this friend and the family that didn't know his body was dead, he felt perturbed, and I avoided talking to her. Just then I saw that the beings that were always with me laughed. Then I fell unconscious, but came to very quickly, and saw I was in a type of refreshing sauna. I could tell that my consciousness was intact. I asked myself if there had been any risk of not being able to return because I felt I had crossed a borderline. Nevertheless, I remember with affection my loved ones, and on feeling sorrow, they said that the decision would be made later. I had the strange sensation of wonder. I felt a tender nostalgia, and I had the feeling of being taken by the hand to undertake a long, much faster journey in a mentholated sensation. I heard cosmic sounds similar to those in electronic music very clearly, with clear echoes, deep cosmic echoes, almost metallic, that surrounded us. I felt a refreshing wind inside. There were exquisite aromas. Everything was warm, like a calm mist, in a perception of a solid base on which we found ourselves. Then came a great surprise. I saw an enormous, shining, golden form. Emerging from its center was a figure of light, very much whiter and stronger than the rest. It made me feel that I would be irreversibly blinded forever. But it kept coming closer to me. Every worry was erased, and I began to realize that the identity that represented myself arriving at a point which I was just a me. Some dialogue had to have taken place with this magnificent being. Between a state of fantastic stupor, where this magnificent being emanated supreme harmony and surrounded me with immense splendor. It was overflowing with knowledge and wisdom and of thoughtfulness of which I was merely a witness. In the end, I could see that between its center and myself was a slice or a differential channel on the floor. It let me know that I could jump over it, but then I could never return. Then I suggested that without living any more experiences, I could return. In the center of the immense fullness and overflowing satisfaction that I had perceived there, I found it almost impossible to leave. I was asked if I still wanted to return, and with a light understanding that there were matters still unresolved. Very agreeably, I replied I could return, and asked would it be possible to send me back. Then I heard a deafening clicking sound that seemed to tear me in half. I was finally able to get away from the great radiance. I was again in a misty plain and refreshingly full. When encountering my previous companions, I noticed a tremendous surprise and incredulity on asking myself what had happened there. That yes, I had returned, and I replied yes. They were almost struck down and thought that this was nearly impossible and would have to prepare me for experiences tremendously more intense. Then they said to me that nevertheless I would continue a life equally torturous and with some success until the appointed time. At that moment, I looked up and I passed people like before who were ascending or descending. Surprisingly and suddenly, there appeared to me a figure of my younger brother, Carlos Alberto. I looked at surprised, and he showed me that soon he would pass over. Around him appeared various people that greeted me even though I had never known them. They let me understand they were great friends with my brother and that they too would go. Many years later, I got to know them in reality. I had never seen them. Then one day there appeared a tall young boy that I never knew who greeted me very warmly. I couldn't tell who he was. He said that he had the same name as me and that we were family. But I just looked at his face of overly familiar features, especially a certain family likeness. Also, much later on, in an opportunity of going back to one of my unforgettable uncle's family, I met with the eldest boy, who I had never seen from infancy. Now the eldest and identical to this one I had seen during the experience, and so it would seem a little bit later. At that moment, I went back to join with my old acquaintances, and they said to me how much further we were from where we had met. It was like a doorway into the mist which ascends for 3 or 4 steps, and they never erased their use. They said, "Well, let's go." When they came close to the door, they indicated that they knew about the steps and would look around. When I put my head around the door, everything around them was immense darkness, more than black, and you couldn't see the bottom. But one of them said to me that I had to take a step. We said goodbye, smiling, and I started to fall in the black, immense, and fathomless hole at a deafening speed that for some moments made me so dizzy and tormented that I started to feel that which I believed to be myself would very quickly burst. I managed to murmur, "I can't stand this." And as if from nowhere, I heard a voice saying to me, "Yes, you can. Put up with it." Then suddenly I felt myself go into a vast emptiness, clearer, in which was heard curious and pretty tinkling like crystals and bells. When I tried to see how far away they were, as if something had burst, it caused me to go into my physical body, where I sat down violently, leaving me rigid, with a huge pain between the chest and the back, which lasted for a while. Then I was able to breathe better and lie down, and I believe to sleep for many more hours. During the experience, I felt as if I was a voluminous body with a stable temperature from which came a luminous tone like a sealed unit totally safe within my own light. I felt an infinity of warm tones, like a landscape of caressing sounds of bells, in clear and resplendent tones as in rain or sun. Intense aromas of aniseed emanated from a refreshing wind, and with a music in it crisscrossing me with a continual sound of mechanical triangles. I breathed oxygenated air that reminded me of my infancy, with the scent of orchids, jasmines, carnations, and tender roses. That which we try to be in worldly society is just an ethical convention and a diet of mathematics, of reason. This environment is necessary to permit fighting for every color with the final evolution of the spirit. The eminent cosmic laws are for themselves. The totality, God, if that's what you want to call him, is an absolute being that lives inside us permanently. Good and evil are in relation to that which we have taken from our lessons. Why do some of us have to travel through the horrors of the darkness? Is it that we have returned more thick-skinned? No, we have simply contributed to that humble but brilliant light, the light of living consciousness. We are predestined cosmic particles with an inducement to run a path of which we are unconscious, happily, but we have the freedom to develop ourselves within our own consciousness to grow or not to. This is the totality of consciousness to which we pertain. No one will judge us, and we evaluate ourselves as to that which is a better growth. I feel lucid and satisfied that the grace that was given to me to go away from myself or remain with myself without implications of guilt and appeared in a tender pollen bath of this world. The being of light is the most exquisite center of harmony and pleasure that allows us to rest in our own forgetfulness. It is the source of our final alliance. The reasonable and limited analysis achieved by our brains and our earthly conventions can't explain or define what you feel close to the being of light. His wisdom and his tenderness are of such a dimension that the limits of our brain won't allow us to capture or explain totally the experience once we have come back. The limitation isn't able to define the immensity. Nevertheless, when we are there ourselves, we will understand. Some people will be able to incorporate in their experience the respective education and say that the being of light is Moses, Jesus, Buddha, etc. I saw as a fantastic being of light without a name. On awakening, I remember that my companions had also come up to give me news of the possible ending the life of my wife, the girl that we would have much later, and myself and our fantastic father would die. These are my thoughts about the experience. The beings that accompanied me had a lucid consciousness and a marvelous sense of humor that you would want in a wise being. Before returning to my body, they looked on smiling. They weren't angels because this is a human concept. These were wise beings of light. With my lucid visions of my life, I have to adapt myself to adverse and difficult conditions. I understand many things about evolution and of consciousness, why we are here, but I ignore quite a lot. From Democritus until the clear spirit and colored spirit of Bergson, I feel that we have ended up contradicting one another, perpetuating the eternal ellipse over and beneath ourselves. With the light of our own living consciousness, we feel the presence of the being of light, stated, celebration, revelation, jubilation, glory, and more for eternity. End quote. And wow, what an amazing story and way to push it, Diego. You pushed it till the end, buddy, and you came back with a great story. There really are no questions. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day.